Welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, I hope you're ready because things are getting really juicy now. Alright, let's time travel back. Alright, you ready for Chapter 5? Let's do this. Alright, so this chapter starts off with Nick coming home after being with Jordan. Nick notes that when he comes home, he at first thinks his house is on fire because he can see such a bright light in the distance. He realizes as he gets closer that it's just Gatsby's house, but that every light from top to bottom was on inside of it. He notes how he thinks that Gatsby's throwing another huge outlandish party, but when he gets closer to his own house, he sees that there's not a soul inside of Gatsby's. As Nick is getting out of the cab, Gatsby strolls over to him across the yard. Gatsby and Nick have a small conversation where Nick lets Gatsby know that he'll invite Daisy over first thing. Nick asks what would be best, but Gatsby interrupts him and asks Nick what day is best for him. They continue to have a small conversation about which day is best. Gatsby also offers Nick a job, but Nick turns it down politely. After the small conversation, Gatsby goes back to his house. Nick goes back into his. He is very sleepy at this point, and he goes to lay down. The next morning, Nick calls Daisy and invites her over for tea. He also asks if Daisy can come alone because he just wants it to be the two of them. The story shifts to the day they're supposed to have tea. Nick lets the reader know that that day it was pouring rain outside. At 11 o'clock that morning, a man in a raincoat brought a lawnmower over and mowed the lawn for Nick. That action reminded Nick that he had forgotten to tell his housekeeper to go out and buy cups and lemons and flowers for tea. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Gatsby arrived with a huge greenhouse of flowers. Nick notes that Gatsby is wearing a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie. Nick also mentions that Gatsby looks very pale and that he probably hasn't slept because of the dark circles under his eyes. Gatsby asks Nick if he has everything he needs for tea. Nick reassures him and they begin to wait for Daisy to arrive. Nick notices the weather and tells the reader that the rain starts to lighten up to just a mist. As it gets closer to 4 o'clock, Nick comments about how Gatsby started to look very uneasy and very upset. 2 minutes before 4, Gatsby gets up and says he can't take it. He can't wait all day. To which Nick responds that there's still a few more minutes left before she's supposed to get there. Just as Nick says this, they can both hear a car turning into Nick's driveway. Nick goes out and meets Daisy in the driveway. He mentions how beautiful she looks. They have a small conversation. Daisy jokingly asks if he's in love with her, or else why have her come alone? Nick jokes back that's the secret of everything. Nick asks Daisy to ask the chauffeur to come back in an hour, and she does. As they made their way back into the house, Nick notices the living room is empty. Just then, a light, dignified knock is heard at the door. Nick went out and opened it, and there, standing in the doorway, drenched with rain, was Gatsby. Nick states that you could see the fear in his eyes. As Nick opened the door, Gatsby walked past him and straight into the living room, right past Daisy. As Gatsby stood standing in the living room with Daisy, Daisy says that she's certainly glad to see him again. He also states that as Gatsby was leaning up against the mantelpiece, he accidentally knocked over one of the old clocks sitting there. After this incident, Nick states that it should be time for tea, and just then comes in with tea for everyone. Nick begins to make small talk to ease the tension in the room between everyone, but he also states that as soon as he found the right moment, he excused himself to go to the kitchen where Gatsby followed him. They have a small conversation, and Nick lets Gatsby know that he's acting like a small child, and that Daisy is just as embarrassed as he is. At this point, Nick states that he has other business that he needs to attend to, and that Gatsby should be with Daisy, that way she's not left all alone. Nick lets the reader know that for the next half hour, he goes into his backyard and watches Gatsby's house. He notes that a little while later the sun begins to shine. He also notes how there was an automobile that came to Gatsby's house for the servants. As the half hour begins to dwindle, Nick goes back inside of the house, through the kitchen, and begins to make noise to inform Gatsby and Daisy that he is indeed back inside. When he enters the room, he notates that Gatsby and Daisy were looking at each other with such content. Daisy gets up and wipes away a few tears from her face. Gatsby, now glowing from this time he was able to spend with Daisy. Nick and Gatsby make small talk. During this, Gatsby asks Nick if he would come over to his house with Daisy so he could show her around. At first, Nick tries to decline politely, but Gatsby insists, whereupon Daisy goes upstairs to wash her face and get ready. Nick and Gatsby go out to the front lawn where they stand in admiring Gatsby's house. Gatsby makes a remark how the house looks wonderful. At the sound of this, Nick asks Gatsby that he thought that Gatsby had inherited the money, to which Gatsby backtracks and says yes, but he lost most of it during the war. Nick then asks what business Mr. Gatsby is in, to which he just gives a short, abrupt reply. As soon as Gatsby says this, he realizes how rude it sounded. So he lets Nick know that he's done business in many different fields: the drug business, the oil business, and much, much more. Gatsby asks if all of this has made him think about the job proposal from the other day. Just before they can answer, Daisy comes out of the house in a gorgeous dress and marvels at the beauty of Mr. Gatsby's house. Daisy says it must be lovely to live there all by himself, to which Gatsby says that that is why he always keeps it full of interesting people, day and night. The group begins to make their way towards his house. They take the long way, and Nick lets the reader know that Daisy takes in all of the beautiful surroundings. As they go to the house, Nick says it's quite different to go into the house when there's not a bunch of people or large parties going on full of laughter, but it's still beautiful nonetheless. They then make their way through every room of the house until they get to Gatsby's private bedchamber. When they enter the chamber, Nick notes how plain his room is compared to the rest of the house. Gatsby then takes some cups from the wall and begins to pour everyone a drink. Nick notes that the entire time they walked through the house, Gatsby never once took his eyes off of Daisy. Nick lets the reader know that Gatsby is now entering a third period of mood. The first being embarrassment, the second his unreasoning joy, and now the third, as if Gatsby was running down like an overwhelmed clock. Gatsby goes to his closet, opens it up, and shows them all of his suits, shirts, and everything else inside. He tells them that he's a man in England who buys clothes for him every season. He then begins to take out his shirts and throw them one by one before them. Nick notes how the shirts were sheared linens, thick silks, and fine flats, which lost all of their folds as they fell and covered the table in many colored disarray. As he was doing this and the clothes began to pile up, Daisy began to lightly cry, saying that she's never seen such beautiful shirts before. They make plans to see the rest of the grounds, but it begins to rain, so they stand along one of the walls looking outside. Gatsby says that if it weren't raining, they'd be able to look across the bay and see Daisy's house from his. Gatsby mentions that Tom and Daisy always have a green light that burns all night at the end of their dock. At the mention of this, Daisy puts her arms through Gatsby's, and Gatsby doesn't seem to notice. Nick begins to look around the room and sees a photo of a man in a boat. When Nick asks about this, they see Gatsby as a young sailor in young sailor attire. Throughout the rest of the afternoon into the evening, they talk and have a good time. Gatsby also asks Mr. Klipspringer to come in and play the piano. Though Mr. Klipspringer tries to politely decline, Gatsby will not hear of it. At one point, when the clouds begin to break, Daisy notices how beautiful and pink they are in the sky, and she notes how she would like to put Gatsby inside one and push him around. As the evening starts to give way, they turn on the lights in Gatsby's beautiful house. Nick also looks out the window and sees that all of West Egg is also turning on their lights for the evening. Nick tries to excuse himself to watch the event. At this, Gatsby adjusts himself. Gatsby then took Daisy's hand, and she said something low into his ear, and he turned towards her with a rush of emotion. In that moment, both Daisy and Gatsby forgot that Nick was in the room. Nick then makes his way down the marble stairs and leaves them alone. This is the end of Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby. Tune in next time as we go over Chapter 6. And as always, stay lit.